they had a job to write a constitution until 1 year, until 1949. They couldn't do it because they couldn't agree on the basic rules, on the how should we live together, what should be the relationship between us, and they said, let's wait. And that's the tragedy.
Procrastination. Judicial procrastination.
Because
here we are.
if they just decided, at least we had something that we could work on.
Welcome to the Z3 podcast. On this episode, we're going to host Dr. Masua Sagiv. She is the Koret Visiting Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley and a scholar in residence with the Shalom Hartman Institute that's based in San Francisco. In this conversation, we'll hear from Masua about her work, what she does, and her perspectives about what's going on in Israel with the judicial reform and the different rising tensions within different parts of Israeli society. I'm Amitai. I'm the director of the Z3 Project, and this is the Z3 Project podcast. It's great to welcome Dr. Masua Sagiv. She's the Koret Visiting Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley and a scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute. It's really, really great that you were able to join us.
It's great being here. It's always great being here.
Yeah, and schlepping all the way from the East Bay. It feels so far sometimes, but it's not that far. But thank you, really. So, welcome to the Z3 podcast. What we try to do here is extend the conversations that we have typically at our events or at our annual conference, and give different thought leaders and community professionals and leaders an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into their own professional and personal background to kind of give insight to our listeners about that, and then from there go into bigger ideas that are kind of top of mind for our community and for our guests, and really have an opportunity to dive deeper in a more in a setting that allows kind of that exploration, as opposed to like an event where maybe there's other there's a panel sometimes, and that just kind of the limitations of that type of setting. So this is really great that we're having you here. Last time we spoke, we were actually in this very room. It was in Shavuot and Tikkun in May, and that was an interesting conversation. Maybe we'll reach that one point or the other, but it's really great to have you here.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to come to the OFJCC.
So,
always.
Yeah. So I guess maybe we'll start a little bit with not too much, just kind of your origin story, I guess. Like how did you become a professor that specializes in this field? Like, where's the background? Israel?
Yeah, so I grew up in Israel in a religious Zionist family. I went to Bar-Ilan University to study law. I knew pretty early on that I'm interested in more in graduate degrees and trying to combine both research and being connected to community and working with community. I went and did my LLM, my second degree in law at Columbia University, where I think this was my first encounter with religious feminism or halakhic feminism. I lived in Riverdale in New York. It was during the year that the first Orthodox woman was ordained as a rabbi, and it was very influential
at Maharat
for me. So she started off as being ordained as a rabbi, rabbah, and then in the middle of the year she changed this definition to Maharat, which is Mora Ilchatit Ruchanit Toranit, spiritual leader in short term. And then it took a few years to go back being a rabbi, which is an interesting topic on its own. But that was the moment where my interest was piqued in questions of the intersection between religion and gender and law. I came back to Israel. I did my PhD at Tel Aviv, and then completely coincidentally, I found myself in the Hartman Institute in a program for women who are trying to finish their doctorate dissertation. And that really changed the trajectory of both my career and my life. Because I became, despite my English, I have no connection to in my roots, there are no American people.
Got it. So no familial connections, no Anglo background.
No Anglo. Yes, that's the word. No Anglo background. I lived outside of Yerushalayim, so also no connection to liberal religious Zionism at all.
Yeah.
So this was my first encounter with all of this world. I was enchanted, and it really combined my areas of interest. And therefore, you know, I found myself in both of these places, more of the worlds of ideas of Judaism, together with maybe, I would say, the glasses through which I see the world are glasses of law and research, I would say, and my materials are Judaism, peoplehood, gender, etc.
Fascinating. So there's a few pieces there that I want to unpack because they're parallel and similar to my own experience. I'm very curious to hear from your perspective. So when you say, just a little bit back, when you say religious Zionist, that's the background in which you grew up.
Yep.
So first of all, I mean, it's worth saying that often folks kind of compare that to modern Orthodoxy.
Yep.
And there's already there's a difference there, and we can get to that in a minute. But even from my experience of growing up in Jerusalem, in that more Hartman orbit, right, of a more Anglo setting, it took me a while to figure out that it's not the same as religious Zionism in other parts of the country. So maybe you can like clue us into like what is that distinction and how does that manifest?
So I do want to say though that what I describe is very different. Or let me say that. Both of the versions of what I want to describe now is very different than the Jerusalem bubble version.
Fair.
But there are still two versions, the one that I grew up in and the one that is currently religious Zionism in Israel.
Right.
So the one that I grew up with, you know, I never heard of Rabbi Heschel until I got to Hartman. It was... How can I describe it? Girls don't get to study Talmud. It changed, but I mean,
this is where we grew up.
It's very like you sit at the women's section in the shul. It's not modern Orthodox. It's not non-modern Orthodox.
Right.
It's somewhere in the middle. It's very right-wing oriented. Very, land of Israel, and then people of Israel, and then the Torah of Israel.
Right. I think like I would say there's like the religious Zionism that we grew up on with the two separate prongs, like the South Jerusalem Anglo infused, then the rest of the country, which also probably shifts if you're in Tel Aviv or in Haifa in the north, or you live in a settlement outside Jerusalem. Or if you live in the south, it's very traditional.
Yep.
It's conservative.
Yep.
Right. Very, very, and it's very much infused with I think like a nationalistic kind of energy. So which is certainly, and I'm stepping here in territory that I'm not an expert in, but that is very more motivated by modernity, but not the same modernity that American Jews talk about in the same modern Orthodox. Right. So it's like it is a newer kind of energy.
It's not modernity in values so much as modernity as a tool. To be a part of the work of the work market. To be and it's not exactly a completely tool like in the ultra Orthodox, the Haredi population, but it's not. You are trying to distill the more instrumental facet of modernity. Even though, I mean, religious feminism the origin of religious feminism is not just in Jerusalem. Right. It also developed in places outside of Jerusalem, but I think that the nationalistic aspect is the strongest outside of Jerusalem.
And then there's the Jerusalem contingent, which is very much infused with like the Anglo world, which is the world that I come from. My parents who made Aliyah. And that's the Hartman circles, Pardes. They've been in Jerusalem for a very long time, and there's something that it's a shade different right? There it is much more in step, I wouldn't say with like contemporary modern Orthodoxy, but certainly those values of the people who came, these are folks who grew up in the 60s and 70s and came to Israel, that really influenced a lot of the energy there, and it's very separate from religious Zionism outside Jerusalem. Yeah. Let alone today, what's going on with the party that co-opted the term and the right wing shift. We can get there in a minute, but that distinction, I think that journey that you described, of growing up in a religious Zionist, a traditional religious Zionist context, you found yourself outside of Israel for other reasons, not for Jewish reasons particularly, and in Riverdale of all places, where I also spent 6 years, and just a few years after you, in the very same places, and that kind of like unlocking this new understanding, then coming back and bringing that to Israel. So you were.
I'll say one more thing about that also. I think that the on the one side you see that outside of Jerusalem it's more the nationalistic aspect, as you said, and inside Jerusalem it's more of the human rights, right? So the Anglo element, as you call it, of religious Zionism in Jerusalem is very much putting forward the values of equality and the values of relationships between groups that are slightly different than the version of outside. And I found myself almost on the way out of religious Zionism when, because I was more drawn into human rights and into equality and felt the lack of equality in my life. And therefore, in a sense, being in Riverdale and then finding myself in the Hartman world gave me a lifeline to go back into a different version of Judaism.
Right. So there's also here a movement of like leaving a very, locating outside of Israel for a little bit, which is hyper, the narratives of nationalism are cut across many groups within Israel, and that's a very strong, of course, identity marker for folks. And then, like, what does it mean to leave that, and what is the shift that could happen in perception when you kind of go out and live as a minority for a year, 2, 10, whatever it is, and what does that do to your perception? I do want to say I think it's worth saying that, of course, like the distinctions that we're making are rough and in broad strokes. There are Anglos living in other places, and it's not the only considerations. But broadly speaking, I think it still holds that within that area, I think the anchor of one being much more about civil rights, human rights, as a driver of Jewish identity, which isn't dissimilar of the American Jewish community that the Orthodox one that we're describing in Riverdale and other places as well, as opposed to like a much more land and national oriented one, which is outside. I think that holds, and it rings true to me, certainly. So that kind of like, so when you got your LLM, you weren't necessarily focused just on, I'd call it the peoplehood equation. That kind of, okay. So then you came back, Hartman, they helped you finish the dissertation. That happened. That happened. I finished the dissertation, which was very interesting. I went, when I came back to Israel, I thought I was going to write my dissertation about the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel and the internet. And then my supervisor and mentor, one of my mentors, one of my supervisors is Professor Manny Mautner, who's very known in Israel and worldwide, actually, also as a legal scholar. He was a very firm critic of the Supreme Court from a liberal point of view of the Israeli Supreme Court. Maybe we'll get to that later on, about the activism of the Supreme Court that actually erodes the public's trust in the Supreme Court, which really, and he said that 20 and 30 years ago, even before the crisis that we are seeing now. And he told me something that I took with me after that throughout my life. And he said that for everything worth doing, there's a test. And the test is the shiny eyes test. Okay. If you're talking about something and your eyes shine, that means it's worth it. And if not, then drop it. Don't do it. So your eyes didn't shine when it came to
Not enough.
ultra-Orthodoxy.
Not enough. Not enough. And then he told me, why don't write about your own questions and your own challenges, which is completely true and resonated with me. And therefore, I started writing about halachic feminism in Israel, and specifically the way that the law is being used in order to promote social change. How is it used? Is it good to use the law? Where are the advantages and disadvantages? What are the different strategies to promote change in society? And then my case study, my very big case study, is halachic feminism in Israel, which again, the origins are American, but the development is slightly different in Israel.
Then what we're seeing, than Orthodox feminism.
Yes.
In the States.
Here in America.
Yeah. Do you want to, like, what are some differences, like, just broad?
So the main difference has to do with the fact that in Israel, Judaism is an established religion, and because it's an established religion, then Judaism is entrenched into the laws and the customs of the state. So you would see that the halachic feminism here, or Orthodox feminism here, was more, at the beginning, now it's a bit changing, but was more focused on ritual, because it was more community-oriented and community-based, whereas in Israel you would see it would be more focused in Torah study that would lead to leadership, that would lead to demanding being a part of the religious establishment.
Got it.
Because that is the way to open the door to get state recognition and power and influence within the state. What you would get in the American society if you work within community and rituals.
Right. So, like, essentially, it's the similarity essentially is about access, of
Yes.
course, and being able to be an established leader and get the support of the mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
America, and the context here is one where it's not an official. Different debate. There isn't an official church in the United States. Different question. But because of that, so that's the arena which it comes. But in Israel, that's where when you start off, I was like, oh, that's not where I thought she's going to go. But you ended up where I thought you were going to say, which is really about figuring out how to get the support of the state mechanism, which are the ones who give legitimacy to leadership, essentially.
Exactly. Yep.
Through laws, through funding, through positions in offices, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. There is a point there that I think it's very, for me, reaffirming to hear, right? This idea that, I don't know if someone probably written about this, but a lot of like the innovation around Jewish life in Israel within the Orthodox world, certainly, is born often or led by folks who weren't born in Israel, because they have this like ingrained or this innate understanding of what it means to be Jewish in a setting that isn't supported by the state. Yep. Right? So if you look at like Orthodox feminism is one for sure, even like kashrut in Jerusalem, right? The folks who led that. You look at Itim and the folks who talk about conversion and that, and who's kind of leads that. Even politically, who's on the more, these are folks who have a much more, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier, like that the anchor isn't the national component of Jewish life, but much more about the human element. Yeah. Recently I had a conversation with Rav Avi Weiss, who ordained me and also started the rabbinical school. And I think you're mentioning Rabbi Sarah Horowitz. Yep. When I was in New York recently, and he said like that when he speaks to folks who are interested in rabbis to become rabbis, he asks them like what's the most important thing for you? He says if the first thing that someone says is the Shulchan Aruch, he's worried, right? If someone says the human in front of me, yep. He feels much more. He says, of course, Shulchan Aruch is incredibly important, but that if you don't see the human in front of you, yep. And that ethos, of course, resonated with me. But I think it's along the lines of what you're describing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in it. It's both, and I think this combines what you just said. It's both being a minority and not the majority in the state, but also living within other communities and not being constantly threatened that the other communities will change you. I mean, it is important to be unique as a community, and this is a struggle, I think. It's as if this conversation is as if, you know, everything is perfect within
a laboratory.
American jury, and everything is horrible within Israeli jury, and I don't think it is, but I do think that, and I think there are a lot to learn, both communities from each other, but I think that the fact that you don't have to completely cancel the other community in order to keep your own uniqueness as a community is also something that is almost ingrained into at least the activists that I see that come, that yes, they were born or trained in America and came on to Israel and became activists in religion and state matters.
Right. It feels like it's as if like in a state context, there's almost like, it feels like the pie is much more limited. And so you, like the power grab between the groups is much more, it feels like it needs to be more, what's we're looking for, much more ferocious almost. Whereas here it's like, well, we have to figure out how to work together because we are part of the same community, and that forces us. And I don't want to romanticize either, like, and completely problematize, because I also am of the opinion that there's a lot to learn from the Israeli context here, for sure, and we can get there. But I am curious more, you know, as you kind of like progress through your professional career and focused on law, and I think this is top of, you know, very relevant today, you know, is like the through line, right? And like, how do you think about, you know, so you finished that and then you stepped into the world, you started teaching, right? And like, if you can maybe share with us a little bit your interpretation of what's happened in Israel over the past couple of years and to this moment, because you also mentioned your supervisor and mentor who had like a critique that may have been part of what we're seeing today. So,
Okay, so a few things happened at once, and in Israel, and we always have to remember it's not happening just in Israel, it happens throughout the world. Almost all the trends that we are talking about, and maybe I'll highlight when we get there. But the first thing that I'll talk about is what I said before about the High Court. So the majority of the population in Israel is right wing, center right wing, in the classic meaning of right and left, in security issues, in welfare issues, and in religion and state issues. It has been that way since the late 70s. Other than a few years of different, really rare few years here and there, every couple decades, where a left government or a center-left government came into power. And the Israeli liberals, who realized from the 70s, who had, you know, their golden years since the establishment of the state and until the end of the 70s, Mautner refers to them to the former hegemonia, the liberal former hegemonia, realized that they're the minority and that they are not going to preserve their power through politics. And they started being afraid for their values, which they believed are the values that should lead the country in general and not just their own. You know, the Israeli liberals are not living in autonomous communities like the ultra-Orthodox live in. They believe that's the way, that's the good for the entire state. But instead of, you know, going and doing the field work, and going to different communities and gaining the trust of the people in order to change policy through the politics, they went time and another, or no, what's the word?
Time and again?
Time and again, thank you very much. They went time and again to the Supreme Court in order to promote the liberal decision. They had the cooperation of very liberal, progressive justices who were the majority in the Supreme Court for many, many years, that developed very activist doctrines, much more activist than in other places around the world, and really change the balance between the legislator and the government and the Supreme Court. That's one point of view, and in that, the critics of the judiciary are absolutely right, absolutely right. The problem is that it's not really true for the past 15 years at least. So there were different reforms going on in the judiciary about the appointment of justices and about and a lot less nepotism than we've seen in 20 or 30 years ago. There are much more conservative justices today, but the perception of the court is the same perception of a very activist court. The doctrines are still with us, and that's part of the problem. But of course, another piece of this is that Israel doesn't have a constitution and that Israel doesn't have any mechanism. It has basic laws, which are normatively acts as a constitution, but the problem is that we have no mechanism as to how to enact basic laws. They are enacted like any other law. It's almost impossible to amend the US Constitution. It's so easy to create the Israeli Constitution or cancel the Israeli Constitution, so we don't know what is the mechanism to enact it, what's the mechanism to amend it. It's not that we don't know, it's just non-existent. And what's the mechanism to review it? Now, in a world that you have a lot of power in the hands of the government, you also want a very strong balancing power, which is the Supreme Court. So you don't want it too strong, but you have to have it as a substantial, you don't want it to decide instead of the government on policy matters, but you don't want the government to have sole limitless power. So that's where we are at from a legal point of view.
So I want to just for a second just review, because so there's an understanding that over the years the Supreme Court in Israel has gained more unilaterally gained more influence over matters that might not have necessarily needed to be under their purview, because it was a reaction.
I will say political.
Political.
I don't fear to say political, but I know that I'm not. This is not consensual what I'm saying.
It's fine. I mean, this is part of what we do here is we have all these opinions, and we're not. It's good to expose as many people as possible to the nuance and understand that there is not, the world is more, and this might be surprising, it's not black and white. It's always more complex and nuanced. But I try to tell to my kids daily, but they don't seem to get that yet. But to this point, for demographic reasons in Israel, and for a sense of a changeover of hegemony and the leadership, the decision, I don't want to be too judgmental, but it sounded a little bit like almost lazy. Right, instead of doing the field work and really building up a movement and explaining the validity of this way of life, it was like the easy route is just to really strengthen the Supreme Court, and that will always be here to preserve the values or the nature of what we think Israel should be or should be run. Yeah. And
I should say I agree completely with the value part.
Yeah, in other words,
I agree with almost all decisions that are the result of this process. But
this process being the
Supreme Court ruling on policy issues. Yeah. The problem is that it's not a good mechanism for a democracy.
Right. So in a country where emotions run high, right, and memory is sometimes long, right. So what's motivating, even if it's not factually still the case, it's like, well, finally we can regain control and do what has been done to, even though like this is a basic precept of Jewish laws, like don't do to others what, right? But basically it's like now it's our turn. Yep. Yeah, sure, there are some, more conservative judges in the Supreme Court, but that's just because you felt you need to make concessions towards us. Now it's our turn to take, the pendulum is swinging, and it's our turn to, as in the people proposing these, the reforms in the judiciary, it's our turn to kind of shape how we are moving forward, and from their perspective, guard the Supreme Court from becoming too politicized. Although
that's not what they're doing.
Right. That's yes. We'll get to a second what they're actually doing. But that would be maybe a charitable interpretation or read of that position.
Absolutely.
And that's what, you know, many folks on the street might, in the electorate, people who are voting, might actually believe.
Yeah.
You know, they don't, they're not, the information is filtered in a different way, certainly, and we'll take a step back and see, like, well, what's actually happening? What is it? Because what I find fascinating in this moment is that, and I think will be the tragedy of the whole thing, is that it's very necessary to use community organizing principles when talking about the other side, right? And this is, again, endemic to the world. It's not an Israeli problem. It's true in other places as well. So you have to, you know, rally the base and use the most extreme terms and use the most extreme tools at your disposal, because it really is a battle for something very, very significant. It feels that way. There's also a layer here of kind of like toxic masculinity. We can talk about that later also, of like this idea of conquest and winning and et cetera. But it's very bad for community building, and the fallout and what's going to happen the day after isn't necessarily getting enough attention in my perspective. But at least the position is, we're saving Israeli democracy. We're saving Israeli democracy, each from its own perspective. But in reality, something else is also is going on. So
because this situation and this problem is being abused.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
By 2 to 3 kinds of how will I define them? Opportunistic politicians. Yeah. I said 2 to 3 kinds because I think that we are in a moment
it's like a perfect storm.
Yes, it's unprecedented in a sense that you have 3 different powers that each one of those is almost impossible to deal with, which is corruption, messianism or fundamentalism, and I don't know even how to define in one word the challenge that is the Haredi community in the state of Israel.
Right.
All of them, their interests are in complete convergence. Convergence. Yeah. Thank you.
And they don't necessarily agree. What I think is so, like, often in these cases, they might agree on some things. They probably disagree on more.
Yeah.
But like it's not cynical because it's the mechanism, right? It's like, don't hate the player, hate the game. You know what I mean? Like, this is the rules. You build a coalition and you can drive forward what you want. That's the trouble. That's the lack of a constitution, you know, lack of constitution, lack of review process, lack of norms and mechanisms. It feels like it can move in any direction.
And the motivation was really, it was pure and it was beautiful because think about the U.S. Constitution. When it was established, the drafters of the Constitution, were they representative of the population in the United States? Of course not. Right. Now, the Israeli non-drafters of the Constitution said, we can't agree and we want everyone to feel included. That's our tragedy. They said, let's wait.
You're saying this was Asafah Mechonenet
that's the constitutive assembly that was supposed to be the first Knesset, was supposed to be also had the role of a constitutive assembly. They had a job to write a constitution until 1 year, until 1949. They couldn't do it because they couldn't agree on the basic rules, on the you know, how should we live together? What should be the relationship between us? And they said, let's wait. And that's the tragedy.
Procrastination, judicial procrastination.
Because
here we are.
if they just decided, at least we had something that we could work on.
Right. Amend, change, review.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't have it.
Yeah. And here we are.
And here we are.
So that perfect storm of these 3 groups, right, who are trying to represent their constituents, saving their own whatever, you know, we can be as judgmental, cynical, or charitable as we want, but the point being those 3 groups of folks came together and now are pushing forward this very expansive reform in the judiciary. Why couldn't it be a topic that we can, like, Israelis can pronounce the word easily. You know what I mean? It's like really
reasonableness. I know.
But in that we've seen something now that's been unprecedented in Israel. 34 or 5 weeks now, I think, of like consistent, fair, like I'd say, very. Consistent is the best word. Demonstrations of cross sections across, of demographics and locations in the country, of like just beating the drum of this is a real threat and a problem to the country, and you were there. You were just there. It's like
Because what these three groups all know is that the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court threatens their powers and threatens their plans. That's what they know. And therefore, we have to limit or eliminate the Supreme Court in its current position or situation, or I don't know what the word should be.
Permutation, maybe, like its current structure, form.
Yes.
We should call this episode "Two Israelis Struggling to Find the Right Word."
Exactly. Yes, it could have been worse.
It could have, exactly.
But we still have more time to converse, so we'll see. And then you see a phenomenon that, we said before that other countries are also struggling with the decrease of democracy, but these countries also look at. It's so funny. I saw a piece in Haaretz in English a few weeks ago, and it said, this is actually the first time where Israel gets positive journalism, positive reviews by leading journals in Europe, because usually Israel pieces are all about the occupation, and now it's all about protesters are struggling for democracy. So it's so interesting. But this phenomenon of, as you said, 33 weeks of demonstrations is nowhere to be seen around the world, and the numbers are not going down, which is unbelievable. Part of this is because we talked before about emotions. People are freaking out. People are so scared about their future, about our future in Israel. Part of it is, it's great because it really matters what the future of Israel will be. It's true that the right is is holding power now, but it's still important to note there were, I think, 2 or 3 right-wing demonstrations in Israel throughout the last 7 months. One of them was close to the numbers of the center left, if you will, of the democracy protests, but the demography of the protesters is very, very different. The vast majority of the right-wing protests were religious Zionists, vast majority. Whereas in the democracy protests, pro-democracy, it's kind of misleading that I say that, because I don't think it's like we want democracy, we don't want democracy. We have different ideas of what democracy is. And I'm talking about the public. I'm not talking about the politicians. I think that some of our politicians would really not want democracy. So the demography of the protesters, I think it's a bit charitable to say it's cross groups in Israel.
Okay.
I think the majority are still secular liberals,
upper middle class, is that?
Upper middle class, but definitely there are religious people there, not a lot. I had someone who came to study with us at Hartman during the summer, and only experienced the Jerusalem protests, told me that he's astonished that it seems like the majority of religious Zionists are for are against the reform. And I said, no, it's just...
It's that same group that you and I talked about in the
exactly,
beginning.
It's the 6 blocks around,
exactly.
around the Hartman Institute.
Yeah.
There are definitely Mizrahi Jews over there, even though the perception of the right is the demonstrations are by privileged Ashkenazi Jews, only secular, they don't care about Judaism. That's the perception that the right is trying to portray that these protests are. They're wrong. They're not entirely wrong. Not entirely. But still, it is an unbelievable movement.
Yeah. So I have. This is where I personally struggle. First of all, like recognizing the fact that I've been here for 10 years, right? And a lot of what I see is filtered through media, etc. But that perception, and I admit that this is probably, I keep on hearing, we talked in the beginning about like where we grew up, right? And the time in which we grew up. And going through like traditional religious Zionist institutions during the Second Intifada, and serving during the disengagement, right? Like there is like this ingrained skepticism, almost, of some of the voices and the groups leading the demonstrations. And as much as on a very, I am quite, I'd say, fearful of what we're seeing, certainly, I wonder, we say like, yes, it's true, and there's also a little bit of like, what else is going under, Mautner's critique also of the Supreme Court, and like, so I wonder how do we talk about it in a way that is constructive and also that it doesn't become, whataboutism, and it doesn't really hurt the goal, which I really do think that if Israel's standing as a democratic country erodes, it's a huge problem for episodes and episodes of this podcast and others, right? Like, and that convergence and that perfect storm is also quite frightening in all kinds of ways. But to the point of like the day after, if this is a voice, if there is a constituency or a group of people, percentage-wise, I don't know, who still believe that. Like, how do we move beyond that? How do we talk about it? How do we actually address those things? And I am curious. I don't want us to say. It's because I know that you have some ideas about like mamlachtiyut and the role, or I don't even know if there's a translation for mamlachtiyut, but this like civic identity, statism. But it sounds a little too. But this identity. Like, how do we develop that identity? How do we talk about it? How do we think about it? I'm always looking for, because the extremes are very loud, but how do we think about it?
I think that I want to start with saying that I think we are in an incredibly important moment in the life of the state of Israel. And I hesitate to say it, but also I think in the life of the Jewish people, because I think that what happens to Israel is critical also to the Jewish people that's outside of Israel as well. I think that for many years, for decades, the tensions that are rising now, that are, full out, they're not rising, they're all out right now, have been dormant, but they were always there. It's nothing new, what we're seeing. That's also important to say. When we were last on this stage, we were at a panel in Tikkun where two of my fellow panelists, MK Rabbi Gilad Kariv and Professor Eran Halperin from Hebrew U, came out really strong on saying this is not a time for compromise. This is a time where I really remember when we talked about bridges, Gilad Kariv said, you can't build a bridge on a shaky bank. And our banks, the liberal Israeli bank, has been shaky for too long. So I want to acknowledge these words because I think they're important. We are in an important moment where each group inside Israel has to look inside and define What are our red lines? How are we willing, really, like, to mindfully live with the other groups in our society? So I think it's an important moment. Where I think this moment is very frightening, and that's what you said, is if we forget the final part where the goal is we still need to live together, and be incapable of compromise. So one question of compromise is timing. Maybe not now, but at some point along the way. And the second thing that I want to say is that I think that the discussion about the values and what would be best for the Israeli future is crucial. And I think that the majority of the people, I mean, we speak in the same language. We should be able to speak and negotiate and navigate the future of Israel between the different groups that combine the state of Israel. Our problem is with the mechanism. Our problem is the same problem that the Israeli legal system or the political system or the system of government has, which is we don't have a mechanism to do that. So we don't really speak to each other. That's also, by the way, the epidemic of social media and the extremist of messages that's also connected to everything that we're seeing. We need a mechanism under which we'll be able to speak with one another. We had friends and colleagues in all of them, and I know that in all of them, which were difficult, and there were a lot of disagreements, but at the end, everyone said an agreement is possible. What we didn't have is trust. And if you don't trust the other side to apply what we agree on, then you would never sign on something that gives up on something that is yours. So we don't have trust, and we don't have an agreed mechanism. If we'll be able to find a way to stop somehow and build ourselves a mechanism and rebuild a trust, then I think this could be a potentially amazing moment for the state of Israel. But we have to find the way. And right now, it's true that we have a government that is doing everything in order for that not to happen. I should also say that this government, even if you set aside the legal reform, this is the worst government that Israel has ever seen. Again, in my opinion, this is the worst government Israel has ever seen in violence, in safety, in
security.
I would say Jewish supremacy.
We just had a minister,
life.
Ben Gvir. I'm sure you saw his atrocious statement, which.
Listeners would hear that at some point, and they would say, "Which one?"
Yeah, which one? Exactly. But today he said something about there was an argument about. I really loathe even repeating it, but who has? It speaks the language of a Jewish supremacy that connotes other forms of supremacy that are totally unacceptable. The piece of the agreed mechanism of how to do it, and it's a mirror of the legal system is fascinating, and I think that it's comically Israeli, right? This is when people talk about Israeli identity in the States, I'm it's not an identity, it's a temperament, right? Of achi, my brother, you upset, right? This, and this, we used to have this unifying experience, the army, right? And because of the familiarity and the positive melting pot versions of it, right? That created a shared there was a shared history, a shared experience, and because of a shared destiny, then it felt like there's a shared language where we can rely on that to work through problems. And what I think is a huge part of what we're seeing now is that there's an erosion certainly in that experience.
Yeah.
In other words, the numbers of people who don't serve is growing year over year. And that's a burden that most Israelis are no longer or not going to be willing to carry anymore. I think also that the I can't say the word, the use of the military in a way to advance political causes, just as they are, as righteous as they are, is going to come back and bite us in the tuchus. Next time someone wants to evacuate a settlement, right?
It's the doomsday weapon that was used before the doomsday.
Yeah, it's like a game of chicken, and now, so there's no mechanism. There's there's no sacred cows in terms of like and that really, above all, worries me, right? And so that's I wonder like how do we I share the optimism. I think it's a disposition. Like this will be a defining moment. Hopefully, like a phoenix we will rise, and we'll write a song about this later. But I'm worried, and like from here in the West Coast, like how do you experience that? From your
coming here after we've been 6 weeks in Israel during the summer, and we experienced, as I said, the protests both in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. I also took my daughter. My oldest daughter is 14. We went together to protest. We also had a different experience where my husband came with me and his kippah to Kaplan in Tel Aviv, and it was also a very interesting experience there. And on the one hand, it was almost a sigh of relief coming here and being away, but at the same time, it was the hardest to come here. I mean, I didn't feel that hard last year when we came back after the visit, or 2 years ago when we came here. And I still feel torn not to be in Israel in this moment, even though I'm kind of like relieved from my own welfare in a sense, because it's, you walk around so tense. Everyone are so tense. Even when they're in the street and doing their everyday things, everyone are extremely tense right now in Israel. And it's filtering into I don't know, everything, your whole experiance. It's really hard.
More so than regular. Like Israel's already a high tense place.
Yes, and it was like a heat wave after heat wave, and this it was. I had a friend who came back, an American friend who came back from Israel, and she said that it felt like a feeling of a political doom, and I agree. The feeling was very, very tense and heavy, even though, also. In moments also uplifting, the one of the most beautiful moments I think was the walk or the aliyah from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the walking, the protest, the march, which by the way drew consensus throughout all, left, center, right wing, everyone admired this unbelievable march that happened through the heat wave. So on the one hand, it's very, very difficult to be here, but maybe this step back is also crucial to think of what can be the way, how can we reach it? And it's also a question of, on the one hand, you say, do I want to suggest a compromise now? Is it strengthening this really, 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 really bad government? Or do I look at the end game, and the end game is, keep having a state and being able to live together, which, slight thing. And how do you navigate these things? There are still initiatives. Neta Barak-Koren, who's also a professor from Hebrew U, with a group of people, academics and religious leaders, and from all the spectrum, sat down and wrote a proposal for a constituent assembly with all the mechanisms in it. This is just one just one initiative. There are always more and more initiatives. People are, speaking and trying to figure out what can we do. I can't tell you right now what the solution is, right? Because right now, yes, we're in a deadlock and it's very, very scary. But I can say that we, how do you say, lo alecha melacha?
Yeah. It's not ours. It's not our task to complete, but we don't have the right to desist from it.
Exactly. So we don't have the privilege to stop trying.
Yeah.
And I think that, and I know that, like literally right now, a lot of amazing people are constantly trying and trying to solve this horrible situation that we are in, specifically through trying to find the mechanism under which this can be solved. I don't think that the court will help us. I don't think that we have a very challenging month ahead of us. During September, the reasonableness petition is about to reach its decision. I truly hope that the court will not decide to invalidate the reasonableness amendment. It's not a good amendment. It's a really bad amendment. I don't think it's bad as in unconstitutional. So I hope the court won't be activist in it. We'll have to see, but I honestly think that we have to keep on trying, and I think that the direction that we should move in is finding a mechanism. I'm not even talking about what's the right solution value-wise is. Yeah. What's the mechanism for us?
Yeah, that really resonates with me, and I have the need to have like a third arena where we can solve this, so we can figure out what that solution is. Maybe in a word, because I think this is something that I've, someone who's like studied the history of it. We mentioned earlier the Constitutional Assembly that dissolved after a year, and then like I'm something along the lines of any following Knesset didn't have the same legal standing. So from like what does that mean from a legal perspective, and like why is it so difficult to come up with this? I mean, politically I understand why it's complicated, but like what's the legal constraints?
You don't want, in general, you don't want any political simple majority to enact the rules that should be eternal rules of the country. Because the political majority has political motivations. Yes. And you want the Constitutional Assembly to have a different kind of motivations, the motivations of how are we supposed to live together here in this country. So every constitution has 3 elements in it. The identity piece, who are we as a country, we the people, the human rights, Bill of Rights, and the balance of powers between the different authorities of the government. You don't really want a regular majority to work through all this, because the regular majority, what they think of is how am I re-elected in 3 years or in 4 years again.
But like looking at a story like a self-aware majority, unlike the American, right? They were.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Now, the part of our problem is that the Constitutional Assembly dissolved, but still, I mean, our current Knesset can actually have both powers. Right. It has both hats in a sense. Right. So it has the hat of I'm a political majority now, but it also have a hat of a constitutional assembly. That's how it enacts, like the nation-state law, the basic law of Israel, the nation-state of the Jewish people, or every basic law. I mean, the reasonableness doctrine was also an amendment to a basic law. So now the question is, should any political majority have the authority to change the rules of the system? And if so, maybe it has to be a special majority. Maybe it should be 80 out of 120 and not 61 out of, or 4 against 3 in our case, which is also legitimate in the by the book. And if so, and let's say that our Knesset decided to be a constitutional assembly, does the court has judicial review over the Constitution itself, not just regular laws, but also the Constitution? These are really heavy questions, and all of them are out together right now with the social tension, with the political tension, with the corruption and the messianism. And what's happening with the ultra-Orthodox society? It's going to be a quarter of Israeli society, and what are we going to do because they're not in the work market? Whew.
It's a lot. It's a lot to deal with. Yeah, it's and then to untangle all that and to create like a separate mechanism is. I don't want to manifest it, but it sounds impossible. It really sounds like I wish that wasn't the case.
The problem is that the people who are in power now needs to give up power in order to do that.
Well, that's the oldest tale of time. That to make that happen is it takes a lot. To do that.
That's our challenge. Now, we do have to say that the situation in Israel is not good right now. The military is in a dire situation. Society in Israel is completely defragmented. Maybe I will say an anecdote, which I think can be more generalized to counter what I just said. When we were 3 days before we came back here, we went to the protest in Kaplan in Tel Aviv. And as I said before, my husband came with me wearing his kippah without a hat. And we were walking around. There are tons of people. It was right after the Reasonableness Amendment. There were, I think, one of the biggest protests Kaplan ever saw. And at some point, someone approximately our age, wearing a shirt of Achim Laneshek, Brothers in Arms, the military group inside the protest, stopped us and said to my husband, "What do your rabbis say?" And my husband says, I don't really abide by rabbis. He said, "But no. But what does they say? Because I know." He didn't want to hear any answer, but it was important to note. He said, "I know that the majority of your group doesn't think that way. You have to pressure your rabbis. You have to pressure your rabbis." And even, in the most secular space Israel has to offer right now, and in the most extreme space that Israel has to offer right now in the protest movement, in the liberal sense, you still, they just needed to see the kippah there to say, I know that the majority is not that way. And you see polls saying that the majority of Israelis want it to be solved. The majority is definitely, is for a compromise, is for a mechanism. So we have on one side a really bad situation within society, within the military, everywhere. We didn't even cover Arab Palestinians in Israel, which is a whole other super important facet of this whole situation. But I gain hope from the fact that the people are still are very passionate, first of all, and they want to reach a solution. I truly believe, and it might be a naive belief because, I'm an Israeli and I have to believe, otherwise I'm going to give up, and I can't give up. But I truly believe that in the long run, the people, they would win over the corrupt government. I have to believe that because the people is speaking in a way that we have never seen before.
Yeah, one of my a friend that I wouldn't paint him as an optimist, typically speaking. We were texting, and he's very much, very much against the judiciary reform. He's very much on the left politically, very, very much. I have immense respect for him. And we were texting, and he goes, "Yeah, I am so optimistic. This will be a case study of how, Israel fought off a populist government. This will be like the case study of how to do so." And I was like, "That's really very much hopeful." Before we end, I have one question that I'm curious, and it doesn't have to be a fully formed thought, but like, is this a moment? I mean, you know, we are in the business of peoplehood and about the relationship, etc. And we kind of talked about the potential value add for this interchange between the two modalities of Jewish life, I'd say, right? And it's much more complicated than just like sovereign and not sovereign, right? There's a whole list of vulnerabilities and powerless. You know, there's a whole, but still there's a dynamic between these two fundamentally different modalities of Jewish life. And like in this moment, what is the role, right, of Jews outside of Israel, but like what, you know, aside from voicing their opinions, continuously showing up in a way that is meaningful, what else, maybe, if at all, is something that we could kind of hope to learn from this context in Israel, and how do we best kind of like bring those worlds together?
So a few months ago, Yossi Klein-Halevi, Amitai Fraiman, Danny Gordis wrote a piece together calling for you know, North American Jews to raise their voice in the context of the judicial overhaul in Israel, which is something that all three of those have never done before. And again, they revisited this essay, I think last week. Again, I think that this moment might also be a turning point in the relationship in the sense that for many years, right, it was the almost demand from the Jewish world outside of Israel was to be either support the government of Israel or stay quiet, right? And now you see different paths of supporting Israel. It's not just supporting the government, it's also supporting what is obviously a big chunk of the people in Israel, which is demonstrating a set of values that is really close to the set of values that, you know, Jewish liberal Americans believe in. So this is a huge opportunity for a cooperation that we maybe, or an expansion of a cooperation that we only seen in smaller points before this movement, the protest movement. I think the voice is extremely important, and the support is extremely important. You know, people from here that speak at protests in Israel are extremely important. Showing up in support of democracy, but also of initiatives and compromise initiatives, like serious compromise initiatives, I think is extremely important, because I know that a lot of liberal Israelis feel very alone right now. They feel that they are constantly portrayed as traitors, anarchists, self-hating Jews. Yeah, you know, the list goes on and on. And I think that this is an opportunity for a real connection and for a real, you know, a moment to start a connection that would then on not stop only there, because again, it's almost ironic that Jews might be the minority here, but this kind of Judaism that the protesters are now not fully protesting for, we should probably work on that more, but this kind of Judaism is the majority here. And that kind of, I mean, we need that in Israel right now. We really, really need that in Israel right now. So, you know, what kinds of support there is? There is this support in organizations, support in voice, support in let's speak with our politicians and try to pressure. There are different kinds of support, but basically it's in the state of mind. Every Israeli, not every Israeli, but a lot of Israelis right now haven't had a vacation in a long time, or even if they had, it's like every week, at least once a week, going protesting is there's a toll.
Yep.
Now, we live right now in a very different world because, you know, we have our events and we have our rhythm and we have our communities. Even like showing up and being involved in some way. Let's say the half of the amount that the Israelis are doing, I think would go a long way.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. You know, that piece that, you know, all of it, but the piece there that you're saying how, you know, maybe 2 years ago, ironically, like the alliances crisscrossed, right? Like the more traditional minded or Jewishly traditionally minded folks in Israel would raise the banner of peoplehood and this idea of Klal Yisrael, of all of Israel are right, related. But they're like, their counterparts here don't share the same necessarily values, maybe that same commitment, but not the same language.
Yeah.
And the opposite's true, right? In Israel, the secular Israelis are like, I'm much more Israeli. Judaism is not for me, it's for those people. But value-wise, they're much more closer. So I also share that hope that this is actually a moment of a deeper commitment, you know, of showing up more, and that I think that's, you know, showing up at events, right? Like that. This is how we express our identity here, as being part of a community and express our values in discourse and in actions and in practice around these values, and kind of supporting them where we find fit, while also trying to, you know, the difference here is that there isn't we don't have to be together, right? There isn't a country, right? So how do we not over-politicize the conversation? So if it does, the price, like there it's a pressure cooker in Israel, right? But it's confined. We don't know what it looks like, but it could, right? Here it's like, well, we could just go our own way. And I think there's a price we pay there. So like it's a very difficult, you know, balance to find. But fundamentally, this idea of like showing up, expressing ideas, values in a communal setting, and supporting them in any way that you find meaningful, I think that's a huge, a great call to action to folks in our communities here in North America. So, I mean, there's a ton more we can cover, but we are running time. So I want to thank you really for a fascinating conversation. And have a doubt it would be, you know, it's like I'm always like, the great opportunity for me in these is like I get to like learn from like experts. You know, that's my bright-eyed moment, right? It's like, this is great. So really, thank you for your time. I really appreciate you, Dr. Masua Sagiv, for schlepping down here and really sharing with us your experience and your wisdom.
Thanks, Amitai. It's again, as I said, I'm repeating myself, but it is really great being here every time.